This video will explain and provide a brief introduction to the LCC Standard Lesson Plan template. This lesson plan template should be used for all of your ECE courses. The LCC Standard ECE Lesson Plan template is separated into three parts. Part 1 is about general information. So the top of the slide, you'll be able to see your name, a spot for the name of the school or the center where you're implementing this lesson plan, and the name of your cooperating teacher. If this lesson plan is taught as a classroom demonstration for an LCC class, this part can be blank. It only needs to be completed if you're actually teaching it in the field with young children. We move into the background part of part 1. So your title of the lesson plan. It can be something creative, it can be something straightforward, just whatever provides some information about what the plan will be about. The curriculum area is going to ask you to connect it to an area of the curriculum that you are teaching. So for example, if you're teaching a math lesson plan, this will be a math curriculum area. If you're teaching a health lesson plan, this will be a health lesson plan. Curriculum area. Your group descriptions will be the age of the children and the size of the group. So for example, if you are going to be teaching a young toddler class, you would write down young toddler and you would write 6 young toddlers. If you were teaching a kindergarten class, you would write down kindergarten, you would write down 30 students, and then to further break it down, depending on the plan that you are teaching, you can then say there can be 6 groups of 5 students. The learning environment is the setting and the total time needed. So the setting is probably going to be a typical classroom setting. If it's going to be someplace different or multiple areas of the classroom, you should indicate that. So for example, if we're going to start at the carpet and then transition to centers, that should be noted. If the students are in 4th grade and they're going to remain at their seats the whole time, that should be indicated. The total time needed is your estimate. You really think from the start to the finish, from your attention getter through your cleanup and assessment. How long will this take? For the materials needed, you will list everything that you would need to teach this lesson plan. Even if it seems mundane, like scissors and tape, right? You will include that in there because that's part of being a prepared educator. For advanced preparation, it would be anything that needs to be prepared ahead of time. So if you need to create chart for recording, students' answers, or if you needed to create a bar graph ahead of time, if you need to laminate something, if you need to, divvy up art projects and materials into groups for easier passing out, that is all up to you. What you see on your slide now is what I call the trifecta. This is your Pennsylvania Learning Standard or Common Core, depending on which age group that you are planning for, your learning objectives, and then your assessment and outcomes. And then underneath is a section for prerequisite developmental skills necessary for success. All 4 of these blocks work together. So when you're thinking about your lesson plan topic, you can start with a curriculum area or a standard, and then you can decide what it is that you want the students to be able to do at the end of this lesson plan that supports that particular standard. And then in the last box, the assessment, the outcomes, what is the degree of completion that you're looking for? And how will you know if students have achieved that? And how will you record that information? The bottom is the prerequisite developmental skills necessary for success. So this is asking you to think about the learning objectives that you wrote in the learning objective section, and then you ask yourself a question. What skills would a student need to possess if they are going to be successful in this lesson plan. So for example, if you're going to say the students will cut out images and sort them into initial sound categories. So you're going to give the students a sheet of pictures and they have different initial sounds. Some will start with the D sound, some might start with the G sound. They have to cut them out and then sort them into groups. In order to do that effectively, the child will need to have fine motor skills. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to cut easily, and that will become a hurdle for them. They also need to have basic phonemic awareness skills. Can they isolate that initial phoneme, that B or the G sound that you're asking them to identify? So that's what we mean by prerequisite developmental skills necessary for success. Carrying on regarding the standards and the objectives and the assessments, on this slide, you will see that there is a link to the PA Keys Early Learning Standards. The standards that are listed, I selected preschool for this demonstration, and you can see that it's updated in 2024, and this is the image that you will click on. Inside, you will find a variety of standards and information. The way that the standards are written, it's intended to be read as at the end of the preschool year, students will be able to answer questions about interactions of body systems, right? So what it means is that we're up here in our pink band, health, wellness, and physical development, learning about my body. We're in the 10th section of the standards. So this is the 10th group of standards, and it's the first standard group. It's called Concepts of Health. So what is the big idea? The big idea for Concepts of Health is that awareness of health concepts provides a foundation for healthy decision making. So that's the goal for teaching a lesson plan that would meet this standard. We want to make sure that the children have a good foundation for healthy decision making. Some of the essential questions that a student should be able to answer is, do I have a basic understanding of my body? So at the end of preschool, so if a child enters preschool at 3 and they leave at 5, right, they're there for 3, 4, and 5, they have 3 years to develop that answer. Do I have a basic understanding of my body? Can I identify basic health concepts that help my body to develop? So if you really want to teach your children in preschool about the concepts of health, those are the types of experiences you're going to design so the children can answer those questions. So let's look at it a little bit, one level down deeper. So 10.1b, interaction of body systems. And you can see here that 10.1, again, that comes from Concepts of Health. PK means that we are in the preschool grade band, and B means we are in that B subsystem, interaction of body systems. So if you're going to, again, help students develop an understanding of concepts of health and the interaction of body systems, one of the first places you can start is to identify and locate body parts. So if you move to the second column, you'll see that it says concepts and competencies, and the PA Early Learning starts with the learner will. If you've sat through any of my lesson planning classes, that might sound familiar. We use TWASBOT. The student will be able to. Doesn't matter which way you express that initial setup, just as long as that's your expectation. What is the learner going to do? So some examples to help students identify and locate body parts: they can participate in body identification games and songs. So it's like the hokey pokey, head, shoulders, knees, and toes, something along those lines. The learner will point to specific body parts when asked. The learner will draw pictures that include some body parts, and the learner will participate in discussions about the functions of specific body parts. So your job as an educator is not to take these concepts and competencies, copy and paste them, and put them in your objective box on the lesson plan template. These are very broad and they might not necessarily match what you're trying to teach, but this is just simply an idea of the types of things that the learner should be able to do if they're going to know about their body parts and be able to identify them. What I really like about the PA Early Learning Standards as opposed to the Common Core is that they provide another column which is titled Supportive Practices. And here you'll see the adult will. So this is an example of things that you will do as a supportive practice to help children identify and locate body parts so that they can understand basic good health concepts. So the adult will provide opportunities to point to body parts when asked, provide dolls and puzzles with body parts, make outlines of body and add details to body parts, provide experiences that highlight the functions of body parts. For example, add a turkey baster to a water table to discuss how the heart pumps, or play a smell identification game. So again, those are not something that you're going to cut and paste and put in your lesson plan template. This is an idea of what are some of the things that a teacher could do in order to develop the big idea and the essential questions of the concept of health standard. You will have plenty of opportunities to practice your understanding and application of the PA Early Learning Standards and the Common Core in your ECE program. Continuing with the first part of the lesson plan template, after you have written your standards, your objective, your assessment, and reflected on what skills a child would need in order to be successful, the next part asks you to reflect on, well, how are we going to ensure that all children can have access to and opportunity to attain the same level of learning? So this requires teachers to do something called differentiation or adaptations and modifications. It's basically a way to ensure that we are not teaching one particular way. So I think if I asked the question, do all children learn the same way? Everyone would say no. And if I followed it up with, do all children learn at the same pace? Everyone would say no. Some children need a lot of extra practice and some children do not. So this is the box that helps you to plan for that type of modifications that are going to be needed to help all of those students. So again, think back to that scissors example. Well, you want to do the scissors to cut out the initial phoneme sounds, but what if you have a child who has a physical disability and they can't use scissors? Or what if you have a child whose fine motor skills are still developing, and using scissors is a great way to practice that development, but in order to get to the part of the lesson plan that really matters, which is sorting those initial sounds, using those scissors is going to frustrate that kid, and they're not going to be able to complete the lesson plan perhaps in a timely manner. So it's adding an unnecessary hurdle to that child's understanding of phonemes. So the more you know about your kids and the more you know about best teaching practices, the easier this section becomes. So it might seem intimidating or daunting at first, but the more you understand how to do this, really the easier it becomes. And this is honestly one of my favorite parts of teaching, is being able to really stretch that curriculum so that all students can have access. So you'll see at the top of this box the letters UDL. So that stands for Universal Design for Learning. If you have taken ECE 210, the Exceptional Children class, you should have an understanding of what UDL is and how it's used. If you have not taken ECE 210, or you're taking it now at the very beginning of a semester, this is something that you're going to learn. So it is not expected that the UDL and the methods to support dual language learners and the modifications to the learning environment are going to be perfect, for lack of a better word. Depending on where you are in your own preparation and your own, course sequences, you might not have any familiarity with that. So we just ask you to try. to start thinking about it. And then when you take that exceptionalities class, that ECE 210, you're going to be like, oh, this makes sense. If you've already taken your exceptionalities class, or you've taken ECE 207, Child, Family, and Community, where dual language learners are specifically addressed, this part will be a little bit easier. But I don't want to stress anyone out with this box. This will not make or break your your overall grade for this lesson plan. It's just a means for the faculty members to understand where your skills are, how are you processing this type of teacher thinking, and how can the instructors of the class help support you to grow. So for UDL, you'll think about the multiple means of representation, the what of learning, the multiple means of engagement, the why are we learning, and the expression, the how are we learning. So any one of these can be modified relatively easily for any student. You'll also think about methods to support dual language learners. You'll think about upward scaffolding and downward scaffolding. So upward scaffolding is, how can I make the lesson more challenging? What if you have a child who is already starting to put simple sounds together and are reading, consonant, vowel, consonant words? That initial phoneme game is going to be maybe not very helpful for them, right? They're past that. So in keeping in the spirit of your English language arts block, how can you help that child progress at the pace that they're working at? Conversely, think about downward scaffolding. How can I make the lesson less challenging? What if you have students who are still working on initial phoneme isolation, right? That they're having difficulty isolating that phoneme. How can I provide them practice without overwhelming them with an activity that's just a little bit out of reach for their current skill set? And then lastly, we can think about modifications to the learning environment. And these can be things like how your classroom is set up. Are they going to be working in pairs? Are they going to be working alone? Will there be any modifications to lighting or to any other type of sensory stimuli? What about the types of chairs the students are sitting at? Will they have opportunities to utilize fidgets? Things like that will can come into that modifications of the learning environment. That brings us to part 2, the method supporting the objectives. So the first step is you will plan for group demographics. So this is where, if you know the group demographics of the classroom that you're teaching, then you can list that here. If you don't know, or you are using this in your LCC classroom, not in the actual field classroom, you can create some demographics. So demographics are things like the age of the children, the race and ethnicity of the children, languages spoken, socioeconomic status, if you know it, anything that would cause a teacher to have to stop and reflect and say, does this lesson plan and the way that I'm teaching it meet the needs of all these learners? So for example, if you're not planning on making any type of accommodations for English language learners, and you walk in and 75% of your class is English language learners, that lesson plan is probably not going to go very well. So you're just going to plan for that group demographics. Then you'll start with an attention getter. So think about, in the classroom, how have you seen teachers get attention? Sometimes they clap their hands, and sometimes they'll play a music box, or they'll ring a bell. Sometimes they'll say 1, 2, 3, eyes on me. There's lots of creative ways to help get children's attention. The thing we don't want to do is just simply expect the children to be sitting ready, waiting to listen and learn. We know as a teacher that's part of our job, is to get them into that state. So once they're there, once they're ready, step 3, is the plan. So here's where you will add a step-by-step process of your method, strategies, and interactions. So the first thing we're going to do is introduce the lesson. So how will you determine their prior knowledge and abilities? So if you're going to teach that lesson on initial phoneme sounds, how would you get the children ready to learn that to learn those skills and practice those skills. You wouldn't just pass out the papers with no direction and just say, okay, put them in groups and this sound goes on this side and that sound goes on that side. How will you know who is really maybe ready to do that? How do you know who is ahead of that skill? How do you know who might be just approaching that skill and might need some extra scaffolding and support? How are you going to get them ready? We call that setting the stage. How are you going to set the stage for these kids to learn? So we have to determine their prior knowledge, and then we need to connect their prior knowledge. So that's going to ask you, again, to once you've figured out what the kids, you have a pulse of what they know or what they don't know, well, boys and girls, today we're going to practice that skill and we're going to do it just like this, so you're connecting the dots for the kids. Then you'll move into guided practice, and this can be whole class or small group. It is entirely up to you, right? So it can be something if you're going to read a story that has a lot of the G words in it. You're going to have whole group at this carpet, right, reading the G book together. Then you might break off into centers, and one center would start to do that cutting and pasting and sorting activity where they're separating sounds. So how you do this practice is really up to you. But you do need to identify what teaching skills or strategies you'll be used. And there's a whole module in this course and all of your ECE courses that will address the best teaching strategies for young children. So you'll reflect on what strategies that you'll be using. How will you support executive functioning? So again, if you're not sure what executive functioning is, if you're new to ECE, this is a time to learn it. If you're seasoned and you know executive functioning already, you can simply tell us how you will support things like impulse control, cognitive flexibility, short-term memory, those things. How will you use language to build relationships? So these are all coming directly from the NAEYC standards, and NAEYC has identified that pre-service teachers who can clearly articulate the strategies they're using, how they're building executive function, and how they're using language to build meaningful relationships often have a much stronger impact on the education of their group. So languages. So that just simply means, are you going to ask open-ended questions? Are you going to reject answers that are wrong harshly? We don't want to do those. We don't want to do those things. We want to use inclusive language whenever possible. The next section down is independent practice. And this is if applicable. You might not have a part of your lesson plan for this group in this topic where they're going to go back to their seats and work alone. Particularly for very young children, that's probably not going to happen unless you're thinking about center-based learning and play-based learning. So you might be talking about different textures, for example, vocabulary words for something that's crunchy or stiff or soft and fluffy or bumpy. You're teaching older toddlers or preschoolers the vocabulary words, and then you have a sensory center set up for the children to freely play and explore. So that would be an example of that independent practice for very young children. For older children, that can be something like using group work. They can work with their group members, or they can work independently at their seat. So guided practice, maybe you're teaching them how to do long division as a math lesson. Independent practice, they're going to do some practice problems on their own at their seat. For that differentiation, perhaps you've modified the type of problems or the amount of problems that the students are working on. They're not all working on the same exact problem because they might not be able to be successful in that way, and then they're just wasting their time at their seats being confused. So you can decide, dependent on the goals of your lesson plan, how you will set up that step-by-step process. And then lastly, a review is good teaching, right? We want to make sure we give the brain a chance to process and absorb that information we have just presented. The fourth item is a terminating statement. What will bring closure to the plan? You can say, thank you for working so diligently today, class. You were, exceptional students. You can say that's it for today. We'll finish tomorrow. But something needs to bring closure to that plan. Cleanup plan, I joke, you only have one if you need it, right? So if you're doing a basic math lesson, cleanup might be something as simple as putting the dry erase markers and the mini dry erase boards back in the bin. You might not have much cleanup at all, but if you're doing like a full-fledged, arts and craft activity with young preschoolers, right, you're going to have a lot of cleanup time that you need to plan for. And then transition. So how will you get the kiddos from this activity to the next activity? So sometimes we sing a song. So for example, if center time is over, we might start singing the cleanup song and then having the children come gather at their tables for snack. If you're teaching a lesson about penguins, maybe you will have the children, waddle back to their seats or to their next activity like a penguin, right? It's a way to bring some joy and some play into an everyday transition. That's what effective educators do. They understand the role that language plays, relationships play, learning should be joyful, it should be playful. That's really how you're most effective in the classroom. Continuing with part 2 of the lesson plan template, step 7 asks students to identify key concepts, questions, or vocabulary. So if you recall back on the slide where I had the standard of concepts of health, there were even vocabulary questions and key concepts that were listed there. So you can definitely use the standards as a base for where to start with the questions that the kids should be able to answer, the vocabulary that's required. But again, the standard is not all knowing. It doesn't know everything you're going to teach for all of your kids. So you do have to reflect on your specific lesson plan. But certainly those standards are a great way to get your brain thinking along those lines. So you'll also add formative assessment. So formative assessment is the type of assessment that you do while you're teaching. So it's something that teachers do all of the time, asking questions, checking homework, doing observations. Those are great examples of in the moment formative assessment. So if the teacher is realizing that a student is struggling, that teacher can pause, reflect on the struggle, and then redirect that student, in a way that's more appropriate for their learning ability. So for formative assessment, you're going to include 5 questions that you as the teacher could ask while you're teaching. So this is not meant to be a script. It's meant to get you thinking, gosh, this is the standard I selected. This is the objective I said that the students would be able to do this at the end of the lesson plan. What are some of the questions I could ask along the way to see if students are understanding the content? So back to that phoneme lesson, the initial sound lesson, you might ask the students, what sound do you hear at the beginning of bear? Right? And they could say buh, right? Then they have that skill. If they hesitate or if they give an incorrect answer, we might need to spend a couple more minutes here, isolating that initial sound. And you can do that by clapping the initial sounds. You can do it by slowly pretending you have a rubber band in your hand and stretching this word one sound at a time so the students really hear that initial sound. So 5 questions that you can ask. They should be labeled to Bloom's taxonomy. So if you're new to lesson planning, don't worry, we've got a lesson for that for you. If you are old hat and you are fully aware of Bloom's taxonomy, you will know what to do. The final portion of part 2 of your plan is application and parent-family community involvement. So the application is the additional practice of skill or learning. So that children need to be active learners, right? We learn through play. We don't learn through sitting doing worksheets and flashcards and, taking notes on the circulatory system if we're 5. But that's not the way we learn. So for that phoneme lesson plan, perhaps as a transition, you might say if your first name starts with the t sound, line up whose name starts with the t sound. So you're getting that practice of that initial phoneme isolation and you're giving them another chance to do that. Or maybe at snack, they're eating, a chip, right? And they're saying, what sound do you hear? Ch, ch, chip. What's the first sound? And again, there's lots of ways to work that in. If you're teaching about body parts, you might say to a preschooler, "Oh, let me see, where are your arms? Give me your arms and I'll help you put your jacket on," right? So something as simple as that, just even as part of a routine or a typical transition, that you are labeling and engaging body parts. That can be really helpful for children who are learning English as a second language. Labeling them in their native language and English would be a great application. For parent, family, and community involvement, if students forget a piece of their lesson plan, it's usually this, so don't forget it. So we know that families are the children's first teachers, and we need to capitalize on their knowledge of their child and create partnerships with them in order to best meet the needs of their child. So you might do things, so you're going to be thinking about, how can I get what I'm teaching in the classroom home to the families? So if you're going to create a newsletter or create a social media post or whatever, your plan is to communicate with families, you actually need to create that and attach it. So if you're going to make a newsletter about initial phonemes, you need to create that and attach it to this lesson plan as if you were sending it home to the families. The other part of this is you can decide, well, I don't really want to send home a newsletter for everything, because your families will just stop reading them because it'll just be a lot. How can I get families to come in to my classroom to share these experiences? So maybe you'll invite families to come in and read, or maybe if you'll have a mom who's a doctor or a nurse practitioner or a nurse or a dental hygienist, something in the health sciences, have them come into the classroom to do a brief lesson plan, right? That would be great to bring in family members. If you don't have a family member that can do that, you can go to the larger community. LCC's nursing students and our dental students, they spend a lot of time in Head Starts and other early childhood classrooms doing exactly this, right? So as part of their nursing preparation and their dental hygiene preparation, they're ready to interact with the community, right? So we'll tap into that. We can also say, all right, I can bring community in, but could we go out to the community? Maybe there's a mobile clinic, near your preschool. You can take a walk down, and obviously set it up first with the people at the clinic, but set it up first, and you can watch the children can talk to a mobile health therapist, learn more about what they're doing, their instruments, their tools, something like that. You can take a walk to the public library, right? If you're working on literacy skills, and have the librarian provide a story time for the child. So again, it shouldn't be something like, this is the last thing I have to think about. What am I going to put in here? Use this as the final way to really tie meaning to your plan. How can I bring families in? How can I bring community in? How can I get this information out to the family? How can I get this information out to the community? And then if you're teaching it in the field, there's a spot right here for your cooperating teacher to sign. So part 3, the personal reflection, is only completed for the plans that you are actually teaching in the field. Your professor may ask you to do a reflection on a lesson that you taught in the classroom as well, so just make sure you understand what your professor's expectations are. But when you reflect on your lesson plan, here's the template that you'll follow, and you can either answer in paragraph form after each header, or you can write a cohesive essay. It's in paragraph format. So it's really up to you and how you want to tell the story of your lesson plan. So you could see from teacher, you're reflecting on your ability, the content of the lesson plan, was it appropriate, or were there a lot of kids struggling, or was it way too easy and the kids just blasted through? You thought it was going to take 15 minutes and they were done in 3. That's okay if that happens. This is not, you're not being graded on your personal reflection if everything went really well or everything went poorly. I've been teaching for about 25 years. I know even the best laid plans can run amok. So you're not going to get more points if you say my lesson was great, and you're not going to get less points if you say, man, I just swing and a miss, this did not go well at all. It's the reflection, right? That's what counts. So if something didn't go well and it went poorly, reflect on it. If something went great, reflect on it because you want to do that again, right? So this is where you get better at the art of teaching. You get to be a better practitioner through personal reflection. So you'll reflect on your use of language. You'll reflect on the child. What was the kid doing during the lesson? Were they putting their head down and off task? Or, were they really tuned in and enthusiastically participating? How do you know that you picked a developmentally appropriate content for this kid in this class? How did you integrate play-based learning? What teaching skills and strategies did you use? So maybe you did an interactive read aloud, as part of your strategy, but the book you picked was really long, and you lost the kid's attention, right? So the strategy was good, but maybe the book was what was amiss, or maybe you did an interactive read aloud and the book was perfect. It met the objectives nicely. The kids were enthusiastic and engaged. All of those things are telling you that you made a really good choice. For adaptations and accommodations in UDL, reflect on what you said you were going to do. And then if what you planned on doing differed from what you actually did, that's cool too. You just say what happened, right? This is what I'm planning on doing. Maybe you'll do what you planned on doing, but odds are you probably won't. Something will change slightly because kids, it's a very dynamic process teaching. You have to really be present and respond to the kids' needs and questions in the moment. Think about the activity overall, and then you think about your actual results. So if you're going to look at small groups of 5 students sorting images into initial phoneme piles, so the G pictures go on the left and the T pictures go on the right, how are you going to know that they did that? Reflect. How will I know if they're able to do that? If I'm working with a small group, I can use observation. If I am working with a small group, I can also take anecdotals. If I'm working with a small group, one of the things that I like to do that we'll elaborate later on in this lesson planning module is I like to think of my assessment buckets for kids. If I have a list, so I might make like a chart with a piece of paper with 3 columns across it. The first column is like my green bucket. These are all the kids that got it. It might have been even too easy for them, right? They got it. They didn't need a lot of extra help. They made very few mistakes, if any. They could have done it even if you weren't there, right? Then in our yellow bucket, those are the kids that you needed to scaffold and you needed to help them a little bit. They could do it, they were successful, but you definitely needed to be there to ask them questions and to listen to them and to guide them in their learning. They were instructional learners, right? They were not independent like the green bucket kids. So my yellow bucket kids, my instructional kids, this was really just right at their instructional level for them. Then the third column would be my red bucket kids. Those would be the kids who were at frustration. And it can be for whatever reason. Maybe their behavior was preventing them from completing the lesson today, or maybe it was that they didn't know how to do it. For whatever reason, if they were struggling to complete the lesson, they would go in that mental bucket, the way that I think about it. So, the kids that are going there, even with your help, even with your support, even with your prompting, they were still largely, they were not getting it. They were giving incorrect answers. They were getting frustrated, not a good idea for those kids to repeat this lesson plan. So those would be the actual results. And that's what I like to do when I'm in the moment, because I'm not going to do a comprehensive checklist or a rating scale or a running record for every single thing you teach in that classroom. You just can't. But by having that mental model, and then while you're working at getting it into that mental state, just having a simple piece of paper and, just write instruction or independent instruction, frustrational, and you can put the kids there. And then you can see at the end of your lesson, what portion of your class really struggled, what portion of your class really did well, and that helps you make all of your accommodations for that next plan, right? So you see how it all follows the circle. I'm using my assessment data from this plan to drive my next lesson plan's instruction and objective and assessment. And the last thing is you'll reflect on what are the suggestions for the next lesson plan. So if everybody was in the green bucket, obviously you're not going to do the same lesson plan and the same skill in the same way because they already know it, right? So that's your cue. All right, for my next lesson plan, we're going to change it up. We're focused on a different skill, or maybe we're going to add a little bit more complexity to the skill with this activity. If a lot of your kids were in the yellow and the red bucket, moving ahead for the whole class is probably not a good idea. You're going to stay back and work on those initial phoneme sounds. So you're going to go back and think about how else can I get kids to practice that initial phoneme sound. And that's it, my friends. So this was just the overview for the template. The next section of videos, I will have a sample lesson plan prepared for you with everything filled in, and I will explain each part in general for that particular plan that was completed. So enjoy and happy lesson planning.